Hello, everyone. In case we don't already know each other, my name is Michaela Narlock, and I'm the director of the Data Curation Network based at the University of Minnesota. On behalf of my colleague, Jake Carlson, and the rest of the Data Curation Network, I'm incredibly excited to welcome you to the third event in our virtual learning series on sustaining open research. At our first event, we discussed the desirable characteristics of data repositories for federally funded research from the funder's perspective. At our second event, we dove a bit deeper into the readiness of academic institutions, including libraries, to meet these characteristics. We will post a link in the chat to those desirable characteristics in case you're not already familiar with them, as well as to our project page where all of the presentations and slides are linked, so you can catch up if you missed those first two events. As just a bit of recap, kind of what we've talked about in those first two sessions, our institutional data repositories, or IRs, serve as critical infrastructure in enabling researchers to share their data when they don't have a disciplinary home in particular. Therefore, we, IRs, need to ensure that our data services and repositories demonstrate an understanding of and alignment with the desirable characteristics. And furthermore, we, as kind of the librarians and data stewards and repository managers, need to demonstrate how we can apply those characteristics effectively in our repositories. If we're unable to do this, we run the risk of being passed over and slipping into irrelevancy. We also briefly in those first two sessions talked about the need for campus-wide approaches to support research data management, but the very real costs that come with this. So today we're going to explore through two case studies and one national perspective, how to make the case for institutional data repositories and services. We have a phenomenal set of speakers lined up. And so after introductions, each speaker will present for approximately 15 minutes. Then we will have a panel discussion followed by plenty of time for Q&A. So if questions come up throughout, feel free to leave them in the chat. But note that we will hold all Q&A until the end. As just a few quick housekeeping notes, this event is managed by the Data Curation Network, so we expect all participants to follow our code of conduct, which we will post in the chat. This webinar is being recorded, but we will remove the Q&A from the recording, just to put that out there. We invite your participation in our shared notes document and in the discussion following the panel, but request that you remain muted to minimize background noise. If you have any questions or comments as we go, you're welcome to use the chat, and you can also private message me or my colleague Jake Carlson privately. And with that, let's get on to our first speaker. So first up, we have Heidi Imker, the Director of Research Data Service and the Ellen and Alan Avner. Oh, sorry, hold on, Heidi. Here we go. Sorry.
Is that too quick? Sorry.
And Alan Avner, Associate Professor in Interdisciplinary Research at the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The RDS helps researchers across the Urbana-Champaign campus manage and share research data. And in her role as director, Heidi ensures the RDS takes a collaborative, user-oriented, and practical approach to research support. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Heidi.
Great, thanks. Can you confirm that you can hear me okay and see my slide fine?
Confirming both.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much to Michaela and Jake for this invitation to speak today, and thanks for so many people for coming. And I hope this quite phenomenal speaker is quite a high caliber to live up to. So I hope what I have to say is of interest to you. So we're at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So that's in the Central Illinois, a large campus with a really big research portfolio. And we have an institutional data repository called the Illinois Data Bank. So my slide changed, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. We're definitely good then. Okay, so we have this institutional data repository called the Illinois Data Bank, and we launched that in 2016. And so it currently has nearly 600 data sets, which is about 12 terabytes total. And it represents, as Michaela mentioned, across all of our entire campuses. So biggest representation is in the life sciences, but then also a really nice amount from the social sciences and also physical sciences, engineering, and just a little bit from the arts and humanities. The Illinois Data Bank as a whole has a lot of features that are in common with other repositories. So we assign data site DOIs, we do curation, we preserve the data files that come into it. Those sorts of things are relatively typical, but I think the reason why Jake and Michaela were thinking it might be useful for us to talk today from Illinois is that one unique feature for us is that it was the Illinois Data Bank has been developed locally, so it's AKA, otherwise known as homegrown, so which is a little bit unique. So, and there were kind of a specific set of circumstances that really prompted us to take this approach, and I'll kind of talk about those as well. But just how it works in general. So the Illinois Data Bank itself is not a repository. What it is actually a web application that interacts with our preservation system. So our preservation system is homegrown. It's called Medusa. And the goal around 10, 15 years ago, the idea was to try to get all of the library's digital content into one place so it could be managed centrally, which would be more efficient overall. And so actually all of our digital content then is in this Medusa preservation system. And so what the Illinois Data Bank does is a researcher describes and upload their data set. And then the Illinois Data Bank basically does a various number of just kind of messaging. So first it sends the metadata to a data site, which then sends back a DOI. And then once we have all of that, then the metadata and the files are pushed into Medusa. So everything for the researcher, though, and even us as curators, looks like it's all happening through just the Illinois Data Bank. From the other side of it, then, when somebody wants to access a data set, they interact with the Illinois Data Bank, to click download, and again, there's more messaging where the data is, or there's a message that's sent to Medusa that says, hey, somebody wants these files, so please provide them, and so that they can download them. So initially, we had all local storage managed by a supercomputing center, but then a couple of years ago, we migrated entirely to AWS, so Amazon Web Services. So that's just kind of the really big picture overview of how it works as a whole. But why was this the right solution for us then? So first and foremost is that we have a small but very strong repository team. So we had developers who could work on this, and we already had a homegrown preservation system that could then be used to interact directly with a web application like the Illinois Data Bank. And in fact, the idea is that we would have everything in this digital preservation system, and then you would have different windows, different applications for different sorts of collections, so they could be tailored to whatever kind of data type it is. So like if you look at some of our other digital library collections, that whole look and feel is quite a bit different because actually the way that people use that data and tend to expect to see it presented is a little bit different. So first of all, we actually had developers. And then Medusa at the time too was advanced enough to be functional. So it was already ready. It wasn't vaporware that everybody was, we thought was going to happen. It was functional. We knew it was working. And it was also successful enough then to be continued. So over the years, even with the example of AWS, we've continued to have to develop it. So it's nothing Shangri-La, but it's been something that's been quite useful to us here at the university, and we're committed to it as a library then. So one of the other things there is that this would allow the data sets to be managed as basically as part of a centralized strategy. And that made a lot of sense to us too. Instead of having this kind of separate sort of thing over here that would always be like, oh, that's that thing for data. By utilizing Medusa, lots of departments in the library are using that then. So it can serve a lot of different purposes. And it also means there's more collective buy-in across all the library as well. And then finally, and this is, I think, not something that's particularly true everywhere, but procurement is quite challenging at Illinois. We are a state institution with all sorts of different rules and regulations around what we can buy and how we can buy things. And it's enough of an overhead that it's something that we definitely consider when we're thinking about if we're making a big purchase. And we did investigate some of the different vended solutions. And it was something to consider. And in this case, it was really, we thought we had the wherewithal to develop the Illinois Data Bank in this sort of way, and that it would contribute to an overall strategy. So the pros for this are, from our perspective, you could also think of these as bugs from a different perspective, but the pros for us right now are that it's integrated. So it's really nice that it's part of this entire system. It also means that it's customizable. So if we have users or us as curators notice something that could be improved, we have to be obviously really selective about how we do that. We could overbuild it in all sorts of different ways, but we can do it. And so we often will wait until, we kind of notice something being problematic for, multiple people or, a period of time. And so we have a better idea then how to address it. But that allows us to be responsive in a way that is really nice. So for example, we've just are revamping how we do versioning. And so that's something that we can do. Cons then is it's a whole lot of work. So even just as a web application, it's an interface, which means you have to decide where does that button go? What does it look like? What color it is? What font it is? What font size it is? And what exactly happens when you click it? And will that be understood by people from lots of different kinds of perspectives? So it's really a lot of work, and it also requires stable staffing. So luckily, our repository group is quite stable. That's a pro in a different perspective, though, I'll say. So from an employee perspective, like they definitely have a job. So that is a good thing. But I do always kind of worry about like it's really important that we keep good staffing there. And that can be, very challenging, as most of us in libraries know. My big picture or my big takeaway point for this is just that everybody's university's context is different. And so the Illinois Data Bank for us was a way to capitalize on the strengths that we have and also try to kind of mitigate some of the weaknesses, which I felt was really around the procurement issue there. So not at all saying that this is something that is appropriate for everyone, but this is why it worked for us in our context. So in terms of, why institutional data repositories, a lot of what I think around this in general has to do with the ability to support the researchers in a really human way. There's, as much as we've all been talking about this for a long time. Lots of people have been talking about it for decades. And in general, there's still a lot of people who haven't shared data, and even those who have, a lot of times they've only shared a very specific kind of data. So to be asked to share other types is something that is relatively confusing for people. So having a data repository is a really nice, grounded and concrete way to talk about data sharing in a very practical sense, and offer that sort of kind of frontline education that is required, the sort of outreach to talk with people, interpretation of different sorts of policies, and how to help them think about, what data is actually going to be appropriate for them to share. And so to provide that support on a really, really human level is really valuable. Also, I'll say there's just not a disciplinary repository for all data types, and there never will be, because research by its very nature is always going to be looking at some sort of bleeding edge. So there's always going to be unique research that's coming out with either unique types of data, unique kinds of experiments, unique formats maybe. And so until there's enough of a critical mass to justify a disciplinary data repository, then there's always going to be these sorts of data sets that don't actually have a home quite yet. And one thing to point out about that too then is that those are probably really quite unique to that university, because there's some sort of bleeding edge research that's going on at your university that is really quite unique. And so that's something that the university would really want to sort of ping on or really promote as valuable and unique to the university as a whole. I do want to say, so institutions do have an interest in the research data created on their campus. And of course, I've got this kind of caveat here. Most institutions will say, including the University of Illinois, is that we retain ownership of the data as a university, board of trustees sort of thing. That varies by campus or university as a whole, certainly by what kind of data it is. And even then it can vary by the nature, and this is appropriate in my estimation, is that sometimes that interest is about protecting it, those sorts of things. So it's not always about making it open, though sometimes it is. The interest always varies. It does seem to some extent by moon phase, just a little bit erratic at times, and quite confusing at other times as well. But I kind of wanted to talk about that just a little bit more in thinking about what does make a university itself like interested in data. So what does your university get out of open data? We often talk about it in terms of like, what is the research field get out of open data, or what is this sort of like kind of big picture or like what does the researchers themselves get out of it? But really trying to think about what does the university get out of it besides like a kind of another demand. Because as Michaela mentioned from previous talks, like it does require resources. So well, what good is it to the university? So we often talk about it just in terms of like broader reach or being able to be compliant or to be competitive with other universities. But as this becomes more and more common, then that becomes it just becomes expected, and that like the push becomes a little bit less. So I keep thinking about what does the university as a whole get out of it and what can be unique about what it's getting out of it as well. So I wanted to provide just a few kind of examples here then from the University of Illinois. So one of the things that we've done is we have Elsevier Peer, and it's branded here as Illinois Experts. So this is our researcher profile system. And we have a really terrific coordinator for this, Mark Zuloff, on our campus. And several years ago, he approached us and he said, hey, do you think we should start thinking about also pulling in research products as data sets into Illinois Experts from the Illinois Data Bank? It was a great idea, and he and Wah, our associate director, then worked together first as like kind of a manual pilot, and then automated it a couple of years later. And I'll just zoom this in for a little bit for anybody who's looking. So now this comes up like right with the rest of the other sort of prominent information, right next to research and scholarships is data sets specifically in our researcher profile system. So, and this is an aggregate then showing that there's these data sets associated for our research. So that's one way to show like another sort of research product that's coming out where land-grant university, we have a public mission. So to provide this sort of evidence of, all of the sorts of things that we do and the actual data that we provide as part of the research. I also in a last couple minutes here, wanted to talk about a particular example then. And my apologies to anybody who has already heard me blather on about this, because I love this example so much, and it's been so much fun to see this work come together. But the moral plots are an experimental field right smack in the middle of campus. So if you've ever been to Illinois, you've probably already heard about them already. They're really, really iconic here, and they're nearing their 150th birthday in 2026. And there were one of the experiments there helped establish crop rotation as a useful practice. It's the second oldest agricultural experimental agricultural field in the world. And it's a really great cultural significance locally. Like everybody knows about the moral plots. They associate it with the University of Illinois. There are songs about it. There are poems about it. There's artwork about it. Lots of alums will certainly remember it because it's right in the middle of campus. Every tour goes by. People walk by it all the time. Undergraduates will help harvest the corn every year. And of course, we're a very agricultural state too. So a couple of years ago, in preparation for this 150th birthday, the dean of the Ag College and one of the really great IT people started thinking, well, what if we try to make the data publicly available for these experimental fields? So we've been working, several people in the library have been working with several people, including researchers, crop sciences researchers in the Ag College to locate that data, which not surprisingly, when it's decades old, has been scattered all over the place, to bring it together in one place and then aggregate, clean it really nicely, and document it really, really well. All those sorts of things you'd actually really like to see in a data set, we've been able to use as an exemplar, and particularly an exemplar then that highlights the university as a whole. So this is something that the university is really proud of, and everybody associates it with the University of Illinois. So we published that in the Illinois Data Bank. So the data itself has been downloaded over 200 times. I always think this should be higher. Actually, I'm just a little bit surprised because it's gotten a lot of media attention. So on LinkedIn, the post from the Ag College had over 600 likes last time I looked at it. There was a recent Library of Friends seminar that had over 200 registries, and they had such great engagement and questions, and people saying things like, "Oh, my grandfather actually helped work on the plots, and he took notes. Maybe I can find them, and maybe that will actually help with your research too." So there was news stories, certainly from the university, but also the Champaign-Urbana itself, regional and even national news stories. And actually just an example of a really serendipitous connection where you have something that has such prominence for the university. I was at a workshop a couple of weeks ago in New York City, and the instructor saw where I was from, and she was like, "Oh, that's where the moral plots are. There's an agricultural field." And they just released the data for that. It turns out her father was a farmer, had read about it in one of the ag news stories, and knew about it. So it was just really, really fabulous. And the data set itself, I have to give a lot of credit to Sandy Kildrone, who's done an amazing job with it, really pulling together some really complicated scenarios and documentation. And that whole team has just done a really great job. But my point is this is something that the university itself, that it's iconic to the university, and it's a way to promote open data and the university at the same time. So it brings visibility to the university's unique contributions. And that's something all of us will have, because there isn't another moral plots at Michigan or Minnesota or wherever. But every one of our places has something that's really unique to highlight, and the data that's associated might be something that is actually going to be something that resonates both with administration, but also alums and the local community as well. So hopefully I didn't go too long, but that was the last of my slides there.
No, awesome. That was so phenomenal. Thank you so much, Heidi. If you could happen to leave a link to the Morrow plots data set in the chat, I'm sure many of us would be happy to have that. So like I mentioned, if you have questions for Heidi or the amazing team at UIUC, you can leave questions in the chat or you can save them for the Q&A. But for now, we're going to move on to our second set of speakers. Now we will hear from Susan Ivey and Moira Downey at North Carolina State University. Susan Ivey's experience in academic libraries has centered on managing and preserving digital assets, particularly research data. As RFS Director, which we'll hear more about, Susan leads in launching, managing, and developing the service. She engages with stakeholders and consults with researchers to better manage, describe, preserve, and make accessible university research data. And with nearly 20 years of experience in academic libraries, Moira Downey has a strong background in research data curation, institutional repository services, digital asset management, and library support for the research lifecycle. In her role as research facilitator, Moira helps researchers assess the computing and data requirements presented by their research and connects researchers with appropriate IT support. And with that, Susan and Moira, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Ivey, and I'm joined by, of course, Moira Downey, my colleague. We're excited to be here speaking with you all today, and thanks to Michaela and Jake for inviting us. And Heidi, thanks for that great presentation and really cool example that you concluded with. We're going to give you a use case that's quite different from our perspective at North Carolina State University. We're going to talk about how we leverage vended solutions for research data repository services, specifically Dryad Data Repository. And then I'm going to kick it over to Moira, who's going to talk about sort of how that fits into a larger portfolio of research computing and data support within the libraries and at NC State University. So how did we get to Dryad? Back in 2013, the NC State University Libraries created a research data committee in response to growing mandates around data management plans and research data management as a whole. And this committee did a lot of things. It was the first support structure available for folks on campus that required assistance in creating those DMPs for the first time. We started the DMP tool in response to that as well. We started a workshop and training series where we would have different topics about research data management available for campus. And then we also provided consultation and, anything under that RDM, research data management bucket, folks could come to us and ask, and we would consult and try to figure out solutions for them. And what we were seeing throughout time was a growing need for people needing to locate, select, identify data repositories. They didn't really know what to do with their data. They knew they had to share it, but they didn't know what that meant or where to go. And specifically from those disciplines that didn't already have, a community adopted data repository. So where can I find a good generalist repository? So in 2019, the RDC made the case for kind of thinking about, let's invest some resources and really maybe think about what it would look like for us to have a libraries endorsed solution for a generalist repository for data. So our first decision at that point was, do we build it or do we buy it? We already had DSpace up and running as our local IR infrastructure for things like theses and dissertations and great literature. And we thought, okay, well, we could, start taking data into our DSpace repository. And what would that mean? And what would that look like? Or we could build a data specific repository. And, both of those options, as we just heard from Heidi, and as I'm sure many of you, all of you know, would require significant one-time and then ongoing investments. We tend to take on a lot of technology projects in the library, and we do value that flexibility. And specifically in thinking about a data repository, the commitment to preservation, the size of data, which is just a significant cost. And we decided, we could devote those resources to providing different types of RDM services instead. And some of those are what Moira is going to talk about in a little bit through our research facilitation service. So we said, all right, well, let's really look and evaluate some generalist repositories that are out there. We created some local criteria, and I'm happy to go into details with anybody that's interested in that. And we kind of landed on Dryad. We kind of narrowed down to Dryad. They had just started their partnership with the University of California, and we kind of liked, their new approach. So they allowed us to have access to a sandbox for testing. So we were able to deposit some, fake data sets, kind of get the user experience down. But we also got access to the admin portal, so we could kind of see what kind of stats we could get out of that, and just really do a deep dive into the Dryad application itself. We did receive approval from the libraries to conduct what we asked for was an 18-month pilot period. We didn't call it a pilot to campus. We didn't want to scare folks away like it was going to go away after 18 months and their data would disappear with it. But we wanted to start out and really, see what campus thought of it, see what we thought of it. We had a set of goals for our research community and a separate set of goals for the libraries. How responsive was Dryad? Did we enjoy working with them? Things like that. So why did we move forward with Dryad and not another solution? First and foremost was that curation piece, including assigning a DOI. Data curation for reuse is really important to us, and it's very time consuming, as everyone that's familiar with the data curation network understands. And so having a repository that was providing curation was really important. And it was one of the only, if not the only repository that we found at the time that was doing that. We were also really interested and pleased with their growing number of integrations with both publishers and funding agencies. And then, that branded instance, they can log in via our institutional single sign-on, and it's branded with the NC State feel. It has an NC State banner and logo, and that really made our research community feel like we were providing them with this repository. Of course, they have a commitment to open and fair. They have the preservation layer that they utilize from the University of California. And NC State also has a historical institutional relationship to Dryad that folks might not know about, but we were part of the first grant for Dryad way back, I believe in 2007 or 2008. So our research community had heard of it. Our libraries were familiar with it. So that was another selling point for us. And then what has this partnership looked like? It's been pretty successful. We really think that Dryad has fantastic customer service. They're really responsive to both us and the researchers. I mentioned we wanted to evaluate them on both of those. A steady increase in deposits over the years. And we've been working with our research community through our data management plan, DMSP review service, and helping folks write into Dryad when it's appropriate. That is when they don't have a discipline repository. So I am going to kick it over to Moira to take over for us.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So one of the threads of our conversation today is, how we can ensure that our institutional data repositories are meeting the desirable characteristics offered by the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and how that effort can reinforce the importance of institutional data repositories within that broader data publishing ecosystem. Because of a lot of the things that Susan just talked about, that's a little complicated for us at NC State, right? So we're relying on Dryad for our local data needs, which means that we don't really have any direct control over that data sharing infrastructure. But we still have this responsibility to ensure that our researchers' data land in repositories that meet those characteristics. So we try not to think about Dryad as just the service provider, but we really want to work to actively partner with them as best we can to help them keep pace with funder expectations. And then really beyond that, to keep our researchers' data fair for the long term. Next slide. So thankfully, Dryad has made that effort quite easy. Generally speaking, they're interested in and very open to hearing our ideas and concerns, and they've been willing to integrate our local workflows and processes from the very beginning. They've also historically been pretty good at entertaining community-generated feature requests. Our membership with Dryad enables us to attend community meetings and to cast votes on policy matters, so things like choosing members of the Dryad board. So we really feel like we have a voice in Dryad's governance and in shaping the organization's future and product roadmap. Next slide. And then, organizationally speaking, we've really seen Dryad be sensitive to evolving funder expectations, and they've made these efforts to be transparent and accountable with their thoughts and their responses. When the OSTP originally released the set of desirable characteristics, Dryad made a point to document how the platform addresses each of the recommended features and then talk about it publicly via their blog. This year, they've also hosted a number of events to discuss how Dryad can help researchers and institutions align themselves with these new federal data policies. And we can do the next slide. Locally, Dryad is a big part of our outreach and education efforts in the library around research data management and data publishing. And as you might expect, it kind of just plays the role that an institutional data repository would in our messaging. We generally recommend that researchers look for an appropriate disciplinary repository first, but we encourage them to consider Dryad for data that doesn't have an appropriate disciplinary home. That message is promoted extensively throughout our library's data management guide on our website, and it's integrated into our research data management education, particularly those workshops on data publishing and finding a repository for your data. I'll note briefly that, our efforts in this educational area have been historically a little ad hoc. Susan mentioned that workshop series that got started. And we're working as an organization to sort of expand and formalize our RDM curriculum, and the desirable characteristics have really heavily informed the advice that we're giving to researchers during those sessions. And then finally, our library's data committee is planning on conducting a local survey for Dryad users, just as a sort of more formal way to remain engaged with our community and solicit feedback, and to help us really understand and potentially convey back to Dryad any outstanding user needs or gaps in either the platform or the service. Next slide. So even though we are here today to talk about institutional data repositories, I also wanted to quickly highlight that for us, Dryad is really only one piece of that puzzle, right? So as I think is the case at many institutions that do have a homegrown institutional data repository, as I said, we're still recommending that researchers put their data in a trusted disciplinary repository when it's appropriate. So we're members of ICPSR for that reason. Not only does that membership give our researchers access to data that's available through ICPSR, but it gives them a place to deposit their social sciences data that, we can feel really comfortable is going to meet those funder expectations. And as with our broader educational efforts, the desirable characteristics have really shaped our individual guidance for researchers, for example, during our DMP reviews, and evaluating those various disciplinary repositories to ensure that they're in alignment, and then going on and explaining how and why that applies to the repository that we're recommending for a specific researcher are really key parts of our education and outreach. Next slide. So as we talked about, NC State has undertaken this cross-campus collaboration that I think is a little bit novel. So let's shift now and talk about what role the research facilitation service plays in promoting data repositories to campus and how those desirable characteristics have impacted that effort. Next slide. So as Susan mentioned, investigating repository solutions and implementing Dryad at NC State was really this libraries led effort. And Dryad continues to be closely associated with the libraries in the minds of campus. So for example, our membership fee is paid out of the library's budget. And as I suggested, Dryad training and troubleshooting still kind of routes through data services staff in the libraries. And on a level like this makes sense, right? Much more so than campus IT units, the libraries have this role as a cultural heritage institution, and they have expertise in making resources available long-term. Digital research data sort of logically fits within that portfolio. And I'm, pretty sure I don't need to convince this audience of that our particular argument. But that really just focuses on the end of the research lifecycle, right? There's this much wider conversation to be had about institutional support for research computing and data needs on campus. Next slide. So to kind of situate our Dryad implementation in the broader conversation around research computing and data support happening on campus at the time, while the libraries were conducting their Dryad pilot in about 2020, a cross-campus team was charged by university administration to do this gap analysis of research computing and data support on campus. They surfaced a lack of clarity about available services, the scope of and how to access each service, and then how to efficiently request and receive assistance with RCD resources. To address that gap, the group recommended the creation of this campus-wide research facilitation service. And in 2021, the role of research data and infrastructure librarian, which was Susan's position, transitioned to the director of the RFS, and additional staff were brought on board. In 2022, we ran a pilot with one of our 10 colleges, the College of Sciences. And then since then, we've been kind of iteratively rolling out to campus, college by college, to make sure we can appropriately scale. Next slide. So here we are, all our shining faces. As you can see, we're this cross-functional team that's pulling from the libraries and the Office of Information Technology to enhance discovery of and access to resources and services to support computationally and data-intensive research. And we're really scoped to consider the entire research lifecycle, right, from project planning to closeout. Next slide. Given that charge, one of our main aims has been to build on the work that the libraries have started and expand the pool of campus expertise around data management and sharing. So the libraries and now the RFS have really driven that conversation. You know, we're investing considerable time and energy in helping campus and especially staff in OIT to understand what a data repository is and what it is not. So for example, the desirable characteristics have really given us a framework to kind of help make the case with campus IT staff that the baseline for example, the baseline 2 terabytes of allocated OIT storage that each campus researcher receives, that's great. That's awesome. That's a fantastic resource, but it's not a repository, and we can't necessarily recommend it to researchers as a way to meet funder expectations. Next slide. Similarly, in collaboration with the libraries, you know, we've worked a lot with the Office of Information Technology and the Office of Research and Innovation to kind of help broaden our campus comprehension of data sharing. In particular, we've really tried to establish this shared understanding of capital P, capital A, public access as the OSTP and federal funders are defining it. We've really had to focus on conveying this message that security is compliance, yes, but public access is also now compliance, right? It's not that we don't have champions for open science on campus. You know, we've got the libraries, obviously, vocal supporters of open science, but we also have a large agricultural sciences program on campus that collaborates with extension services throughout the state. Those are folks who are all very much into public data sharing. At the same time, we also have a big engineering school. So things like intellectual property concerns, you know, research commercialization, technology transfer, industry partnerships, and we get a lot of funding from places like the Department of Defense and Department of Energy, which means that a lot of time, attention, and energy has kind of settled around security and compliance. So historically, open has not been this like critical motivator for much of campus. So we're really trying to shift the compliance model on campus to include public access to research data. And of course, you know, the role that institutional data repositories, again, in our case, Dryad, play to that is critical to that public access piece for a lot of reasons that we've touched on here today. You know, having an institutionally branded home for data that's trusted, contextualizing the platform in a broader program, and then providing a solution for that long tail of research that's coming out of your institution. Next slide. That's all that we have. And I'm sure Susan and I are looking forward to the further conversation.
Thanks so much. You already have a couple of questions in the chat that you can chat if you'd like, but we can totally save those for discussion at the end too. And now we've got our final presentation from Tina. I apologize. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Baich?
Baich.
Baich. I apologize, Tina. Tina Baich, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Scholarly Communication and Content Strategies at IUPUI, and Sparks Visiting Program Officer for the U.S. Repository Network, or USRN. She leads the development of a strong U.S. repository community with the aim of ensuring university repositories have a voice at the table with other stakeholder communities, adopt interoperable good practices, and are innovative. Tina is also the Senior Associate Dean for Scholarly Communication and Content Strategies, and her portfolio at the IUPUI University Library Center for Digital Scholarship includes resource acquisition and description, resource sharing and delivery services, and the Ruth Lilly Special Collections and Archive. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tina.
Great, thanks so much, Michaela. And thank you to Michaela and the Data Curation Network for inviting me to be part of this panel and to talk with you a little bit about the U.S. Repository Network. As Michaela said, I'm the visiting program officer for the U.S. Repository Network working with Spark, and that's a 25% appointment in addition to my responsibilities at IUPUI University Library. So for a little bit of background, the U.S. Repository Network is really a partnership. CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, has an initiative to strengthen repository networks globally, and Spark was really the logical partner to help catalyze a U.S. repository network and bring us together and try to bridge some of the silos that sometimes occur between institutions in the U.S. And we started this work in September of 2021. And I like to emphasize from the start that the U.S. Repository Network is an inclusive network. It's an inclusive, distributed network committed to advancing repositories in the U.S. through advocacy, good practices, and community building. In this context, U.S. repositories refers to all open research repositories based in the U.S., regardless of content, host, or platform. That is, repositories containing articles, data, gray literature, emerging forms of scholarship, repositories hosted by higher education institutions, research centers, or other nonprofit organizations, and repositories using open source or vended platforms. All are considered to be part of this network and are welcome to participate in the USRN at whatever level is at their comfort and in that ability. But we do hope that all repositories get value from the U.S. Repository Network, even if they're not able to participate at a high level. And I will probably say USRN most of the time through the rest of this, rather than saying U.S. Repository Network. So hopefully that acronym is now abundantly clear. USRN is guided by a community-driven strategic vision for U.S. repositories that was developed through a multi-part community consultation process. And you see that strategic vision here on the screen. Just to say a little bit more about this, we really believe that repositories are a key component of open research infrastructure, providing an avenue for the open dissemination of research outputs and making those outputs accessible to all with an internet connection. As such, repositories play a crucial role in increasing equity of access and supporting compliance with funder policies for open or public access. The USRN seeks to support the nation's open research repositories in cementing their position as an essential component of our national research infrastructure. And our role in providing that support and in advancing that vision is really to provide a national voice for the distributed network of U.S. repositories, to advocate for the role of a distributed network of repositories in our national research infrastructure, to further strengthen the distributed network of repositories in the U.S., and to collaborate with policymakers and funders to transform research communications. And really acting collectively, repository hosts can leverage their power to strengthen repositories and interact with other types of services in the research ecosystem, adding value and leading to significant innovation in the landscape as well. A network approach enhances the ability of repositories to also define common standards and practices, as well as provide mutual support and advocacy. So to talk a little bit more about how we believe we build value for repositories, I'll dig into the three areas a bit more. So our focus right now in building value is on the human network. So less on the technical side, more on the human side. And as I mentioned earlier, we are focusing on advocacy, good practices, and community building. So to give you a couple of examples in each of these areas and how they build on each other. So when the OSTP memo, Office of Science and Technology Policy memo came out, USRN drafted a letter and sent that on behalf of the chairs of our steering group, talking about our support of the memo's direction and our desire to collaborate going forward. You may or may not recall that the OSTP memo also mentions that, these desirable characteristics for data repositories were already available, but pointed to a next step of creating desirable characteristics for digital publication repositories, which we at USRN saw as an entry point for interaction with OSTP and the federal funding agencies, as well as a place where repositories should have input. So we put together a small but mighty working group to develop some desirable characteristics of digital publication repositories. It's a real mouthful. And that version 1 is available now via the website. And I can drop a link into the chat at the end that takes you directly there. And that desirable characteristics document that we developed is based on the data repository desirable characteristics that the federal government put out in advance, as well as CORE's community framework for good practices in repositories and the Plan S requirements for OA repositories. And if you're familiar with the CORE or Plan S documents, they have sort of tiered categories of desirable characteristics, ones that are sort of not required, but more desirable, I guess. And we focused on those sets of characteristics rather than the full gamut, because one of the things that the working group wanted to do was balance feasibility and necessity when defining the desirable characteristics. And that desirable characteristics work really leads directly into that next area of good practices. So as we were doing this, we recognized that not all US repositories currently possess all the resulting desirable characteristics. And in some cases, the characteristics represent what we believe repository platforms should be able to do rather than what they currently do. And while we recognize that we didn't want the desirable characteristics document to become overly detailed and sort of overwhelming as a document. The working group repeatedly pointed to the need for more detailed guidance to help support movement toward these characteristics. So USRN plans to provide the guidance and advocacy necessary to assist US repositories in attaining these characteristics and will advocate for their adoption. And the advocacy piece is kind of two-sided, right? We want to advocate for repositories to implement the characteristics and good practices that relate to those. And then on the opposite side, we want to advocate with federal funding agencies to show that we are demonstrating that we meet those desirable characteristics, thus making this distributed network a viable public access compliance route. And having those repositories that are part of the network sort of count as designated repositories for compliance, if you think about the language in the OSTP memo. And then finally, for any of this to be successful, we really need to have a continued focus on community building and community engagement. As dedicated as I have been to trying to involve as many people as possible in this process, I know there are still folks that haven't heard of the US Repository Network yet, or haven't been as familiar with our work. So plans for this are currently in the works, how we're going to continue to build the community and that engagement. But we definitely want to create a space or spaces for collaboration and for learning from each other. And we also want to build external relationships and partnerships, like with the Data Curation Network, to advance common goals, particularly around these sort of companion desirable characteristics documents, and make sure that we're sort of aligning and moving in the same direction. So I love that notion that Heidi gave us about what does your university get out of open data. And I wanted to sort of end on a similar note of, I've talked about the value that the US Repository Network brings to repositories, but what value do US repositories bring to a variety of audiences? And I think, we bring value to the research ecosystem through all of these efforts by providing the public access to research outputs that can enhance their learning, their well-being, all manner, their ability to contribute back. The repositories provide researchers a no-cost option for funder compliance and enhance the visibility and impact of their research. They provide institutions a full picture of their research output, and they provide funders a mechanism for monitoring compliance with their open or public access policies. And I will say that I know we may not be entirely there yet on the second two, but those are goals of enhancing those shared good practices and thus interoperability, and help us make the case both locally and nationally that repositories are critical research infrastructure. And if you want to get updates about the U.S. Repository Network or get involved, you can go to that link to find out more about our work, or scan the QR code to go directly to an email list sign up sheet. So I'll pause there for a minute so you can maybe have a chance to do that. And also just say thank you again for having me as part of this panel. And my email address is on the final thank you slide if you want to get in touch with me with any specific questions that we're not able to address today. Thanks.
All right. Thank you to Tina and to our presenters, Susan, Moira, and Heidi, for 3 excellent presentations on this subject. So we had a number of questions in the chat that have been answered to various extents, but this is panel, so I do have a couple of questions for our panel before we dive into our Q&A. And the first question we have is one of the themes of these series has been institutional repositories, institutional data repositories in particular, being critical infrastructure to enable researchers to share their data effectively. And the question that I have, and I think was touched on by all 3 presentations, is what makes institutional data repositories critical infrastructure, and what is their place in the larger repository ecosystem? So we talked a lot about the impact on the university. Could you also address sort of the larger repository ecosystem? Who'd like to go first on that one?
I'm happy to jump in and people can follow on. I think, I think they're so critical in the overall research ecosystem, especially with the expansion of public access requirements to include all the federal funding agencies, not just the big ones, and to include the data underlying publications resulting from federally funded research. Like, all of that means that data repositories and institutional support of data management and sharing are increasingly crucial pieces of research infrastructure and services. And to the point of, I think all of the other panelists made the point that there won't always be a disciplinary repository available, right? So it's really critical that there are multiple options available to our researchers, and that they don't end up having to pay large fees to comply with public access policies.
Great, thank you, Tina. Other thoughts?
I can just say too, just from kind of a thinking about, our higher ed in general, but universities are under a lot of pressure to prove themselves, right? There's a lot of different things coming from different questions. What is it exactly that you do there? Like, why are you worth all this investment? And I think it's one of the ways to show, and it's also a way to show, I think, that research isn't just this tidy little paper that comes out at the very end. There's all this other stuff that happens with it, including a lot, complicated data, complicated different types of data. And where is one of the things too, where I think the institutional repositories come into this is that kind of, I call them like compound data types or complex, where there's different types of data that really have to go together in order to help somebody understand, everything that happened for a specific study or project or something like that. Where disciplinary repositories tend to focus on a specific data type, which is wonderful. And that's how you can aggregate them all together. So you've got all of the gene sequences together. And so you can then do different sorts of things on that data than if you had had, you know, all the different types of data together. So it's just honestly like a different way of organizing research data in general. And I think it really helps like convey the nature of research and convey the value of our universities as a whole when we're able to show what we've done.
Great, thank you, Heidi. Moira, Susan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think there's a trust dividend that's achieved with institutional repositories that, you know, researchers, oftentimes we hear from them that they like to keep their data that's someplace institutionally branded, both to leverage the reputation of the institution and because there's some confidence that, you know, that data is going to be around long term. The institution has made a commitment to the platform, and that's not necessarily always the case with disciplinary repositories, often which are grant funded or, you know, soft funded in some way, or with something like, you know, before I started at NC State, I was at Duke helping with their research data repository, and we had a particularly vocal faculty champion who liked to tell a story about a colleague of his saying, well, I just put all my data in GitHub. Microsoft will never buy GitHub. And then that happened, you know, 2 weeks later. So there's a little more confidence that that data will be available long term.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think, you know, actually, I think you made this point, Maura, that the institution provides a set of services, including a repository or can provide a repository, but it's much more than that too, right? So a lot of researchers that we interact with or engage with are really kind of at a loss for how do I share my data in a way that's both satisfying the requirement that I'm subject to, but also that it's meaningful, that I'm investing work and effort to get something back out of it. And that kind of answering those kinds of questions really requires, I think, boots on the ground in a way that institutional repositories can provide, because we're providing not just technical infrastructure, but the social infrastructure, the service infrastructure behind it, in a way that domain repositories and generous repositories often can't do because they don't have the same kind of setup the way that we do. I thought that was a pretty important point. Okay,
Yeah.
well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to chime in and say, you know, I don't know how much we got into this in our presentation, but like one thing that we tried to do with Dryad, even though we're not the technical owners of the platform and we're not maintaining that, we tried to build up that service around it to sort of to provide that to our campus. So even though we don't own that repository, we're trying to do services, create services, provide services like many IRs or institutional data repositories staff are doing as well. So
yeah, absolutely. So we have one more question for you, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for their questions. So how will developing a roadmap towards meeting the desirable characteristics of data repositories, that document we've been talking about on a regular basis, how will that help institutional data repositories underscore their role as essential critical infrastructure?
Well, I can just jump in and say very simply that it provides a ground truth, right? Like a common framework for us all to talk about this, because this is a space that people tend to have a lot of terminology that is vastly overloaded. And so, you know, having a common understanding of what makes a repository sort of trustworthy, I think is extremely helpful. And so adhering to a roadmap that matches those agreed upon characteristics, I think will just advance everybody's efforts.
Yeah, I think it also just demonstrates to the funders who are, you know, putting forward these desirable characteristics that there's an effort to adopt those characteristics, and that we're meeting, you know, their expectations. You know, I think that's an important part of this as well. And I think having that roadmap and that common base to go from also helps us with a huge piece, which is the interoperability piece. And having that, you know, enhancing our ability to communicate across repositories, to connect related research outputs, and to be able to search across repositories to create a fuller picture of funded research, right? That's something that I think both higher ed institutions and funders are really interested in, is being able to track the outputs of their faculty or of their funding, and see, you know, sort of the impact of that work. So I think that's another really important piece of us working together on executing a roadmap.
Yeah, and to, I think, build off of both of those too, and some of the other comments, it also just helps the researchers understand, and, you know, to some extent too, our administrators, in terms of what the community, what general has been decided what to expect. So if you're back to the GitHub example, is like, I love GitHub, it's wonderful, it is extremely useful, but that's not actually what we mean, what we mean in these sorts of contexts. So it helps underscore, yeah, no, these are the kinds of characteristics that we're looking for when we're talking. And then they also have another sense of what to expect when they're accessing data from different places. And then back to when we're, you know, talking with university or library administration, like why GitHub isn't right, or why, you know, why this, you know, these other things, like, well, we don't really want to swing for whatever this thing that could be more expensive, or, well, it's because this is actually what constitutes a repository, and so we need to make sure that we're actually providing what is expected, you know, of us, that sort of thing too, as well. So whoever said, like, it's a ground truth, right? It provides that from multiple different levels then, which is really helpful.
Great, thank you all.